Overwatch is the latest game from Blizzard. While I'd like to talk about Overwatch as if it exists in a vacuum, it's hard to not bring in how Blizzard is handling the game. The marketing is quite extreme. If you weren't aware, during and for a few weeks after their open beta, they had a contest with Taco Bell, and you could even have gotten plastic cups with Overwatch characters on them while it was going. This leads me to my core complaint with Overwatch. It's as good of a game that money can buy, but it doesn't have much of a soul. Overwatch insists on playing it so safe that you can almost hear the marketing team telling the art and game designers to make changes. It does seem as though Blizzard has put enough money behind Overwatch that it will be popular regardless of whether it's an okay game or an amazing one. None of these things are inherently bad, nor do they mean the game is automatically less than it could be. In Overwatch's case, it leaves it feeling like a very polished game that doesn't have anything particularly new or interesting to offer. Aesthetically, it's a fairly nice looking game. To say that it is inspired by popular CG family films that have had success recently may or may not be fair, but it's functional and identifying the game's characters is not difficult. Unfortunately, while the characters at a glance may seem like a colorful cast of unique heroes, it turns out to be more of a tired roster of cliches, archetypes, and sometimes even stereotypes, which is incredibly strange when it's so obvious Blizzard is trying to make a game that is progressive in its diversity. You have characters like McCree, who is a cowboy. That's it, he has no nuance or twist. One of his arms is partially robotic, but this is not used mechanically, and if it's used in his story or voice lines, I did not see or hear it. That one could be considered low-hanging fruit. Tracer would be a better example. If you don't know much about the game, Tracer is Blizzard's poster character for Overwatch. She's British and energetic. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be clever here, I'm actually attempting to describe her character, and that's all that comes to mind. I could tell you that she can teleport and rewind time upon her person, but that doesn't say anything about her personality. She has a backstory, but it only serves to contextualize her abilities and has nothing to do with informing her as a character. Most of the cast seems to have this issue of either being a straight cliche or one idea with an archetype haphazardly stapled onto it. The characters also have my pet peeve, which I realize is a personal one, of featuring referential and mimetic humor. Most of these come in the characters' equipable voice lines, of which each player is allowed one per hero to play at their discretion. Overwatch goes the extra mile and does not even bother to have any of the references they make relate to the characters making them in any meaningful way half of the time. The most obnoxious example, in my experience, was apparently what Blizzard thinks a gamer is. Someone who speaks in game jargon and emoticons outside of their appropriate contexts, shouting such lines as "nerf this" when they use their most powerful ability and "winky face" as an equipable line among other emoticons. Your mileage will vary, but it got some genuine cringes out of me with several of the characters, including one that I honestly can still not tell if it is satirically over-the-top edgy or is just actually an immature idea of a dark and cool character. Poe's Law plays into this, but it doesn't look good in the context of the rest of the cast. There are some designs that are fun visually, despite very few, if any, being nuanced, original, or interesting. That goes double for the backstory of Overwatch, which seems to involve a civil war for sentient robot rights, but has no relevance to anything happening in the moment-to-moment of the game. For a multiplayer-oriented game like Overwatch, things like characters and backstory aren't critical to how good or bad the game is, but there is quite a bit to criticize in those areas. As a game, Overwatch can be described as a class-based shooter. Where Overwatch is trying to differentiate itself is in its roster being large and having abilities that resemble those of a MOBA character, including an ultimate. Calling Overwatch a MOBA is incredibly misleading, however, as there are no NPC enemies, lanes, towers, levels, or anything of that sort. It's a shooter at its core and nothing else. It's hard to say if having abilities on the classes, or characters in Overwatch's case, gives them more nuance than a class in a comparable game. Treating the game as if it's some sort of shooter-MOBA hybrid is entirely superficial as well as inaccurate nonetheless. Another way Blizzard tries to make the game feel less like a shooter is by organizing the roster into roles. In Overwatch, there are 6 offense, 6 defense, 5 tank, and 4 support characters. This distinction seems to be to aid inexperienced players in creating functional team compositions, as even with the way Blizzard describes the roles, there are inconsistencies. Supports are described as being able to heal, for instance, and one of them cannot restore health. Offense heroes are described as mobile, and several defense characters have movement abilities. I could go on, but I feel as though it's more of a guideline than anything. The game even advises players on what heroes it thinks their team needs if it sees holes in the roster when selecting a character. This tends to be suboptimal more often than not when a decent chunk of the cast doesn't fit their role or is flexible enough to cover a couple. Where more or less a competitive shooter lives or dies is in its balance. Overwatch is passable in this regard, but where on a character-to-character basis the game is balanced, there are some odd things going on. It's worth mentioning that Overwatch is deliberately balanced for casual play. This is nowhere more apparent than with the characters' ultimates. None of the ultimates seem broken, but they all revolve around giving a single player the power to take on several players to the entire enemy team for a short time. Ultimates charge over time, and while this effect differs from character to character, the idea is for them to be a trump card that is used once in a while. To some degree, each character having an ultimate balances this out, but there are certainly ultimates that are better than others. While I wouldn't say they are unbalanced, it certainly can create situations where your death and sometimes even loss can feel very cheap. On the other hand, all the ultimates do require good execution to be effective, so a bad team is never going to beat a good team by using ultimates. In scenarios where the two teams have comparable skill and it's just a random public game, it's hard to say if ultimates trumping player skill does or does not happen. It's a messy aspect of the game, but it's nowhere near as large of a balance issue as one might assume. Another way the game tries to be more accessible is by inflating each player's score. Instead of having kills, deaths, and assists, Overwatch instead presents you with eliminations and deaths. What isn't obvious about this is that eliminations are kills and assists combined, which beyond being misleading, deprives the player of information about their performance. Blizzard goes one step further and doesn't have a scoreboard or any other way to see your or anyone on either team's stats. In the same vein, they have a play of the game at the end of every match to highlight, well, what Overwatch deems to be the greatest moment of the game. Unfortunately, computers are not that good at reading context, and even more so, this system very much prefers bursts of damage and kills. After watching the play of the game, 4 players who had good stats in one way or another during the match get displayed. Each other player in the match may then commend one of these 4 if they choose. These commends do nothing outside of making the commend number go up and making flashy effects go off. As far as I could tell, Overwatch does not even track your commends after this process ends. These ideas are interesting, but they are so tightly controlled by the game they do not feel very meaningful. Many times the teammate or enemies, which I felt like performed the best, neither got the play of the game nor the commend roster. These mechanics feel like they either are not very functional or designed to keep the attention of less engaged players rather than reward skilled ones. The biggest problem Overwatch has is how lopsided the roster is. There are only 3 supports in Overwatch functionally. There are 4 support characters, but when 3 can heal teammates directly and efficiently, and 1 cannot at all, that odd man out cannot support a team by themselves. So, you have 3 characters of which 1 must be on your team for it to be functional. There are 21 heroes in Overwatch, but you'll see at least one of those 3 on both teams every game. Hopefully, anyway, if only one team has a support, that team has a pretty big advantage. While 12 members of the cast are offense and defense, which in many characters' cases you could argue the labels are interchangeable, there are, as mentioned, 3 supports and 5 tanks. But one tank is an oddball who lacks the shield creation capabilities that every other tank has. If you were hoping to use odd strategies that don't involve 4 offense and or defense characters, 1 tank, and 1 support, you're probably going to struggle against the metagame Blizzard is trying to establish. It is strange that in a game selling itself on a colorful roster of characters, an imbalance of available roles creates so much unnecessary repetition even in casual play. This uneven roster seems as if it would have been easily avoidable just by having a couple more tank and support heroes. It does not make the game unbalanced or broken, but I don't understand why it's even an issue. Could they honestly just not come up with enough ideas for support characters? It feels like Blizzard is trying to enforce a meta for casual play by design. There isn't necessarily a problem with that, but in a game with a big roster like Overwatch, not having much room to experiment strategically with team composition is a lost opportunity. What keeps Overwatch from shining beyond the roster imbalance is the character's mechanics. While it seems out to steal players from games like Team Fortress 2, Dota 2, League of Legends, and even arguably Counter-Strike, a majority of their roster has abilities lifted directly from set games. You might think being a shooter would create a unique identity for the game, but none of the character's weapons are particularly unique either. It seems like no matter what you find interesting or enjoyable about Overwatch, another game does it better. That is not to say Overwatch does these things poorly, but rather it doesn't do the things it's copying better or more uniquely than the original. Overwatch also tries to make everything as intuitive as possible, sacrificing the possibility of more complex mechanics to make the game easier to pick up and play. Overwatch doesn't seem to have much of its own identity. Even more so than other hero shooters that have this issue, If the game's mechanics are only so-so, it seems like a hard sell to players coming from games Overwatch mimics. Which is a shame because Overwatch is fun. I played quite a bit of it and I enjoyed most of my time with it. It's a polished game with enjoyable, if shallow, characters, but all that fun just feels so manufactured. It feels like the latest big-budget Hollywood movie. All of the marketing research was done and a popular director made it so that the investors would be sure to make their investments back. But as a consumer, you're left with a fairly meaningless, if not flashy, experience designed first for casual play and second for higher level or competitive play. It's hard to recommend Overwatch, but I wouldn't want to discourage anyone legitimately interested in it either. At the end of the day, it just feels like a game ought to create a following by competing with games that it's inferior to. While I'm sure the game will have a healthy player base for some time, I'm not sure what it has that other games, some of which are free, don't have. That's all I have for this analysis review thing. So, if you liked this video or hated it, let me know. I'll leave how up to you.